Support for the Forward's Bintel Brief podcast comes from listeners like you and from Edward Blank, whose generosity makes this program possible.
Hello, and welcome back to A Bintel Brief. We're back, everybody. It's season 2 of Bintel the podcast. But as you know, we got our start as a printed advice column in the Forward way back in 1906. So technically, this is our 116th year of providing Jewish responses to life's trickiest questions. I'm Ginna Green.
And I'm Lynn Harris. And Ginna, I need a Jewish response to a tricky question, actually right now, as it turns out. It's coming up for this weekend, okay? It's things are getting better in COVID terms. We're getting ready to do our favorite thing, which is have people over for Shabbat, a couple of people. The other thing is that now our family tradition is that every Shabbat, 8 p.m. sharp, RuPaul's Drag Race. Inflexible. So, what do? Do we have people over? Do we watch RuPaul? How do we balance
I love this question because it's so easy. You balance it by bringing in RuPaul and the people who want to watch RuPaul. Only invite over the folks who are going to enjoy Drag Race as much as y'all.
Yeah. And they have to come in drag. Optional.
Challah and drag. It's perfect.
And then the next day, we can sing Vishamru Paul. Thank you.
One important thing to get out of the way before we get started is that we can't do an advice podcast without your questions. And we really want to hear all about the stuff that's keeping you up all night. What are you grappling with? What are you thinking about? You can reach us by either emailing your question to bintel@forward.com. That's BINTEL @forward.com. Or
if you're more of a talker than a writer, you can always leave us a message at 201-540-9728. Again, that's 201-540-9728.
Here at A Bintel Brief, you know that we answer questions that are light and airy sometimes and questions that are tough and challenging. And today is one of those tough and challenging days. Since World War II, before it even ended, there's been pushback against the reality of the Holocaust. Conspiracy theorists have questioned its veracity, skeptics have minimized its scope, and Nazi sympathizers have outright denied that it ever happened. Holocaust denial is nothing new. As we all know, it's still a serious and even growing problem, one could argue. And that same old question persists. What can we do, politically, personally, globally, to end it? That's the topic that we're going to take up today.
The famous refrain is never forget. But as time passes, we do forget, or worse. In 2020, a survey found that 63% of adults under 40, those who were surveyed, did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And more than half of those thought the toll was fewer than 2 million. 23% said they believed the Holocaust was a myth, had been exaggerated, or they weren't sure. That survey was conducted by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. It also found that 49% of American adults under 40, that's nearly half, have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posts on social media or elsewhere online. So we know that Holocaust denial and distortion are everywhere. What do we do when they show up in our own lives?
Dear Bintel, this question has been on my mind for a long time. I have a friend of over 60 years, an Orthodox Christian. Growing up, we were inseparable, sharing many life events and adventures. We think similarly about many issues. Years ago, my friend made a statement that shocked me. She radically downplayed the number of Jewish Holocaust victims and went on about other Holocausts, which, I agreed, regrettably exist. She wondered why people in the Middle East don't just follow Gandhi's example. She never says Israel, instead referring to the area as the Holy Lands. Recently, I expressed sadness at the steep rise of anti-Semitic incidents in this country. She replied that Jews are not the only ones who are persecuted. I said I recognize that Asians and Muslims suffer hatred as well. We soon went on to another subject.
Years ago, I started to challenge her numbers. but stopped myself and didn't broach the sensitive topic again. I felt, as I do now, that the attempt would evolve into something negative that would hang over our heads or even pose a threat to our friendship. She has relatives from a country bordering Israel. She's either unable to think globally, is ignorant of history, or can't handle conflicting opinions. Every country has serious, multifaceted issues with which they grapple. We could have started there, or at any number of entry points, but I had a bad feeling about going forward, that the dark cloud would intensify. Is my friend a Holocaust denier? Or a numbers denier? Are the terms equivalent? To me, the answer is yes.
I felt bereft long ago, and I'm still lacking a good solution. The easiest option is to drop it and avoid it at all costs. We live in different cities, haven't seen each other for years. We have generally delightful talks about every few months. What are my other options? D for denial. All right. D for denial has laid it out before us. A very timely question.
Very timely. Some of it's hard to hear, but it's important to respond to. So here we go. Well, first of all, let's start with the quote unquote easy part. And that's the part where she talks about is my friend a denier, a Holocaust denier, or a numbers denier, and what does it mean? And the answer is yes. And that part, there actually are accepted definitions for the different types of things that are in the family of denial. And I know, so in other words, I know what she's asking. Like, she's not saying it didn't happen. So does that mean it's not Holocaust denial? What it does mean is that it's something that has come to be called Holocaust distortion. There's an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that has provided these working definitions that are actually really helpful and really important. So Holocaust denial refers specifically to any attempt to claim that the Holocaust just didn't happen.
That's a high bar, right? Then for denial, meaning that the only way someone's statement or words or actions can be classified as denial is if they're outright saying it didn't happen. So all of the other things, like D for denial's friend, is something else then.
Yes, there is something else, and it's arguably just as dangerous, if not even more. And that is what's called Holocaust distortion, which are intentional efforts to minimize or excuse the impact of the Holocaust, or let's say minimizing the number of victims, or going a little farther across the line, attempting to blame the Jews for causing their own genocide, or casting the Holocaust as a positive event, or really even blurring responsibility for the concentration camps, the death camps, by kind of spreading the blame to other nations or groups. So for the purposes of this conversation, for sure, it's probably helpful to say what this friend is doing is Holocaust distortion, but that does not make it less important to grapple with, because the point is they're both forms of anti-Semitism.
Correct. Right. I mean, to your point, when you were beginning to explain this distinction, you said, what I'm about to say is arguably worse than just saying it didn't happen outright.
Yeah. The ideas at the core of distortion are horrifying, but we have language now that makes them into sort of wolves in sheep's clothing, because the language the friend is using sounds thoughtful of let's not forget the other countries that have in fact, or other nations, or in all the definitions of nations have experienced cataclysm like this. But that is even more dangerous because it sounds less horrifying, so you can see why someone hearing that would not immediately reject those ideas the way they might someone who sounds like they're completely off the rails.
And Lynn, what you just said reminded me of this term that's become quite popular over the last couple of decades, oppression Olympics, right? It's referring largely to, in this country, particularly racial and ethnic minorities who've had, as we all know, the experiences that Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latino folks have had in this country. Like, we're fighting over who's had it worse, who wins that gold medal for suffering. And it reminded me of a story. Recently, I was offered an opportunity to travel to Germany to study with a group for about a week in June to learn from how Germans are handling reconciliation and repair post-Holocaust, and sort of bring some of those lessons back to the work that I do in the United States. And I was telling this to my husband, and he said, "Oh my God, I have no desire to go to Germany at all. Like, I don't have a desire to learn from them, to be there, and certainly not to be in the presence of concentration camps and so much death and destruction." And I said at the time, I was like, my immediate reaction was a little bit oppression Olympic-y, I must say, because I said to him, I was like, I understand. I don't want to be there either. And I didn't want to be on plantations when I was a kid, and we would go there for field trips. And I think that his reaction to that was, whoa, is Ginna trying to equate American chattel slavery with the Holocaust? And the truth is, I wasn't trying to equate anything, but he was triggered by the fact that I would bring those two experiences of two peoples into comparison, which brought me into this notion of, people always say we can't compare apples and oranges, but the truth is actually we can compare them, and we can study them, and we can know that they're different. We know that they're both fruits. We know that they're both from trees. We know that they all both have seeds. There are similar characteristics. And while I'm not trying to hold the oppression Olympics, and I sure as hell don't want that gold medal, but I think it's important to understand and to see exactly and to feel exactly how these conversations play out in personal relationships, right? And that story that happened that I just told about my husband and me and American chattel slavery not versus the Holocaust is one where it can show up all the time in people's everyday lives. And I really do feel for the experience that Dvir Denial had with her friend.
Yeah, I mean, and just to think, you two in that conversation were triggered and it was difficult, and both of you had the best of intentions, at least at some level. And so, which is in contrast to, for example, whataboutism, right? Where people are actually aggressively trying to say, well, what about in a way that minimizes, what about Cambodia? Well, both. It's both. So it's apples and oranges. Okay, so we've talked about how we define what Dvir Denial's friend is saying, which, and our answer is maybe that, it's Dvir distortion, and that is bad. So her other question is, what do I do? And in my opinion, what are your options? You got one option. And your option is you have to say something. You have to say something. There's a bunch of reasons. We can look in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, we read about an expectation of not looking away from something that you see is wrong. Not looking away, not pretending you didn't see it, not subduing your eyes, which is the way Rashi describes it. Once you've heard your friend say these things, you can't avert your ears and you need to open your mouth. When you minimize, you make something actually more palatable. And when you cloak something in the language of equity or whatever you want to call it, like let's think about other groups too, it sounds even more palatable, which makes it even more pernicious. It normalizes. Dvir Denial, or distortion, says the easiest option is to drop it and avoid it at all costs. And I say the costs are way too great.
And I'll just point out that by doing that, there still may be a cost, right? She still may lose the friendship, like whether or not she decides, but she's got to. She really must address this head on with her friend. And I think that she knows that. I think Dvir Denial knows that really she can't let it go. And that she wrote to us for a little bit of that, handed her back, if you will, and some support and some, actually what you're thinking you need to do, you absolutely need to do. And even though it's not going to be super pleasant or comfortable or an enjoyable experience, it behooves you to speak to her and to have this conversation.
We'll be right back after the break.
I'm Rachel Fishman Feddersen, publisher and CEO of The Forward.
And I'm Jody Rudoran, The Forward's editor-in-chief.
Together, we're reinventing the nation's leading Jewish news organization for today's diverse American Jewish communities.
We're carrying on a 125-year-old tradition of exposing anti-Semitism, holding power to account, and helping American Jews explore their identities, debate political issues, and connect to their culture.
And we're doing those things in new ways that resonate with today's Jews of every type and stripe across generations.
But we're a reader-supported nonprofit, and we can't do it without you.
Please give whatever you can to support independent Jewish journalism by going to forward.com/donate.
Now it's time for an esteemed second opinion from the Forward's archivist, Chana Pollock. Hi, Chana. Welcome back.
Hi, Chana.
Hi, Ginna. Hi, Lynn.
Hello. Okay, so D for Denial wrote us about the question of Holocaust denial and also about advice on her relationship with her friend. So the letter we want to talk about with you, Chana, is about just that. How to relate to your friend when there has been some kind of betrayal.
Right. So in 1969, the Forward got a letter that a survivor from Poland who had emigrated with her husband first to South America. Now they were living in United States. And she was having this problem with a friend of hers, and she kept up the friendship. They kept up the friendship, and the friend decided to come visit the couple in America. And everything was going fine, even though, the writer writes that, my house is small and we don't have a lot. And she comes and, she stays for about 2 weeks or so. And then as time goes on, she leaves and, she comes for another visit. And after this visit, where she came with her daughter, the writer finds out that she's been dished, to her neighbors by this South American friend about her former life in South America. So she doesn't give us a lot of details of what exactly transpired, but she does tell the Forward how absolutely just embittered she was by the gossip. So here's just, a little quote from the letter of what she said. Now I found out that my friend dished about me with my neighbors and made up some stories about my former life in South America. Despite it being merely foolish gossip, it really upset me, and I stopped writing to her. And now this. My friend and her 2 children are preparing to visit New York once more and to stay here with us, and I don't know what to do about it. So I'm asking for advice. I hope you'll answer promptly. So the Forward, does kind of say well, it's hard to actually know what to tell you because you haven't given us that much detail about, what the issue is. Really, what's bothering her is the Forward decides there's 2 things. One thing is the gossip, and the second thing is the just an issue of boundaries. And what was interesting to me too is just in the Yiddish, the writer used the word baretzich, which is like slander or, malicious talk or being dished. And the Forward uses like a little bit of a more highbrow Yiddish, we would call it Lashon Kodesh Yiddish. It comes from Hebrew, and they use rechilus, which is like, Lashon Hara, like gossip. So, but they also kind of have a tone. They say, epis arachilus. And so what they suggest to her is that, could be there's been a miscommunication. Could be there's, it's all a big misunderstanding. But we suggest 2 things: that you come clean, that you speak honestly to your friend. And also, at the end of the day, even if it's a misunderstanding or even if it is, something extremely large that's insurmountable, at the very least, you'll have, she'll know where you're standing and honestly understand where you're coming from. And the second thing is that you need to set some boundaries. You're not feeling well. Your house is small. This is the 3rd time around and you're not feeling so great about the friendship. Feel free to say, I'm happy to see you, or not happy, as the case may be, but you can't stay with us.
Or as my father says, fish and company, they both smell after 3 days. So what I'm hearing, Chana, is that old Forward And new forward, Bintel Brief, Lynn and me and you, we're both telling people, you gotta talk to the person. And in this case, she really did. Like, we really do need to talk to the people. And also another parallel between this letter and D for denial that I just want to point out is the boundaries piece, is sort of the next phase. Like, after you talk to her and you find out what was at play and what was underneath the gossip, then you might find that the friendship has run its course.
And I also think it's really relevant to note what the transgression is between these friends, that it's gossip, which certainly in our tradition is taken as seriously as murder. And there's also, of course, if you go from there, there's a parallel between what happens in this letter and the Holocaust distortion, where there is lies out there.
Right. It's interesting. This is a newspaper that's actually addressing like a suggestion about gossip. Right. And like the bigger picture, and obviously standing here today, way past 1969, we know about, libelous rumors or fake news. Right. That it's just what you're saying. It's like it's so difficult to combat it. Right. And that a lot of Holocaust denial refers back to historic, rumors about Jews. Right. We think they're idiotic, et cetera. But once they catch hold, it's a fire. And then what we've seen, obviously, in this part of the century is, especially with social media and digital media, right? It's like it's very difficult to put out like the domestic fires that start with gossip.
The response to this letter gives the letter writer, basically gives her permission not to engage. It doesn't say she must disengage, but it gives her permission to disengage. And I think, to me, the parallel advice here is you do not have to continue a relationship with anybody who, if you think about it in the way we framed it, is denying who you are.
I think the issue of betrayal really sings strongly to me from both of them because, and I was really taken by the fact that the writer of the letter in 1969 introduces herself first to the forward as a survivor. I'm a survivor, and this is what happened to me. I lost everybody except one child. That's what remains. But here right. And then she goes on. And so, and in the letter of the friendship of 60 years that's about to break up over Holocaust denial, it just made me think about the type of what it feels like to be betrayed by racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia. Like, it's a very particular kind of hurt, right? Survivors talk about like, I was an upstanding citizen of Poland, Ukraine, right, wherever it was, Germany, right? I was an upstanding citizen, and all of a sudden I wasn't. Tremendous, tremendous betrayal to be so hated, right? So I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but I'm saying the concept of betrayal reads to me in both of them in a similar kind of fashion, that it's something that somebody is no longer willing to necessarily live with, but they also want to offer their truth. Right.
So obviously we have the letter in English in the script. What is the Yiddish word for insensitivity?
Oh, okay. Actually, it's really sweet. Thank you for asking. They said, in discussing what she did, they said, and you realize that I called it insensitivity. They called it nicht feiner Handlung. Her, you can it's almost transparent. Her bumbling way of handling it. Fine it can be beautiful, can also be sensitive, can be delicate. Her indelicate and Handlung can be business, but can also be handling of affairs.
That is really interesting.
That's what makes the first letter obviously extra personal. It's not just the offense that the friend carries these beliefs and might write about them on some dark corner of the internet, or even just listen quietly to them in some forum. But the fact that they actually decided at some level in their brain and their heart that it was okay to articulate them to their Jewish friend. That is a spectacular level of insensitivity and betrayal.
Chana, thank you for bringing this letter from 1969 to us today to help shed some light on our conversation about D for denial.
Thank you for helping us add that layer, the deeply painful personal layer to this partly political and social question.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us look at, how the personal is political and back again.
Always. Thank you, Chana.
Thanks, Chana.
Given that this is not a unique situation, we really wanted to talk to an expert about how to address the issue of Holocaust denial and distortion and educating on traumatic subjects writ large, which led us to Boaz Dvir, Assistant Professor of Journalism at the Belisario College of Communications and founder and director of the Holocaust Education Initiative. And he's leading this work at Penn State University. Boaz, welcome to A Bintel Brief.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Boaz, I introduced you, but I would love to hear how you would introduce yourself.
I'm a journalism professor at Penn State, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. I make films about ordinary people who undergo extraordinary circumstances and transform into trailblazers who impact society.
Thank you so much for being here. One of the ways that people, whether maliciously or otherwise, distort or minimize the Holocaust is by comparing it to or lumping it in with other atrocities. When you're educating people, how do you responsibly draw the connections that are appropriate, that in such a way that actually illuminates the Holocaust and actually might help connect people to it?
Excellent question. And there are many schools of thought within, obviously, Holocaust education, but you could divide them if you wanted to into two schools. One that says the Holocaust is unique, it's too unique, it needs to be taught on its own, it should not be compared to anything. The other school of thought, to which we belong, says, yes, the Holocaust is unique. But number one, every atrocity, every suffering, every genocide is unique. And the best way we can honor the victims of the Holocaust is to contextualize those lessons for us right here today.
So, Boaz, I want to actually talk about this concept of trauma-informed education. And I think it's a term that we've been hearing a little bit more about in the regular conversation. Can you tell us what exactly that is, how it shows up in the work that you do, and, explain that for our listeners a little bit?
So first, excellent question, and let me demonstrate through action the value of it. We have two cohorts right now of about 20 teachers each who are going through a year-long professional development program with us. The very first project that we produced, it was a trauma-informed lens module, because teachers have to be able to identify and cope with trauma among their students and for themselves. And yes, when you take on a difficult topic such as the Holocaust or slavery, you can trigger trauma.
So, Boaz, trauma-informed education is going to be it's a recognition that trauma as an experience, as an effect, has utility in both healing from it. We want to make sure that teachers in classrooms in these settings are able to recognize it exists. It may be living in my students in this moment. And as a teacher, being trauma-informed means that I know that. And then I'm recognizing that, and then I'm holding that in the instruction from beginning to end, and recognizing that it might show up in different students differently, and being prepared for that, and then being prepared to move from trauma to healing because we've had that recognition from jump.
Very well said. I would only add one thing to it, again, which is the complexity of it. That, yes, the first step may be simple, and for most teachers it's needed, and that is, it exists, let's not make it worse. Absolutely. But the next step is to realize it's complex, and there are great teaching opportunities here if done correctly, if it's done with love, with compassion, with true educational equity.
What would be true? Let's say the Holocaust Education Initiative, you're doing your thing in Pennsylvania, it's available to teachers and school districts across the country. What's true in 30 years? How do we look as a country if we've adopted these types of approaches to handling and discussing and navigating these really difficult topics?
This is the best question I've ever heard about the initiative. The best.
You heard it here on A Bintel Brief, folks. Let me just remind you.
This is by far the best question. That's what this is about. And that 30-year concept is elusive to us. We think in quarters. We think so short, right? And we don't understand that we have an opportunity with every generation to actually alter our society if we're willing to be patient, because it's not going to show up today. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to sound a bit bombastic and a little hyped, but I mean it. I really do believe that if we adopt this approach, of working with teachers to be effective instructors of difficult topics, we can transform society. If kids start to understand what the human condition is all about, if they start to tune into it, that alone can transform them as human beings.
So in our letter, we don't have a classroom. We don't have young, fertile minds. We have two fully formed adults. What tools or even storytelling approaches might you recommend, or what approaches might you recommend to the person who is asking us for advice?
So we're asked constantly to take this program to adults. Now, we work with adults, but our ultimate goal is obviously to get to the K-12 children. But this is what I say to people, and it's just the sad truth. For what we're talking about in terms of transforming society and really instilling new perspectives and skills and insight, it's very difficult when you're an adult. It's very, very difficult. It's much easier when they're young. If you confront someone with the facts, you tend to go nowhere. At best, they dismiss them or come up with their own alternative facts. At worst, and this can happen, you encounter the backfire effect. And that is, the more convincing you become, the more you're triggering the fight or flight response, which leads your conversation partner, friend, relative, whoever it might be, to actually get entrenched even more in their core belief, not less. You're strengthening what you perceive as to be a false position. The only way, I think, to really convince adults, storytelling.
So what's a story that, what's an example of a story? What do you mean by storytelling in this case? What's an example of a story or a kind of story that the letter writer could share with her friend?
The listener could tell her a story about her own experience, maybe around an anti-Semitic experience that she went through, something different outside of the realm of their friendship. So it feels like a story and not, an attack. But a story, maybe facing anti-Semitism, her own experience dealing with difficult topics, maybe a story related to her own Holocaust education and how it influenced her identity and her trajectory as a human being. Finding a story to tell is the way to go. And then letting the friend kind of make up her own mind and read through the line. Also, the other tip I have is to go in with no expectations and no judgment. Come in with no judgment, no expectations, tell a story, and see what comes out of it.
Boaz, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. This is a challenging topic, and your insights have been really helpful as we figure out it's not just between our letter writer and her friend. This is actually global in need. The ability for us to listen, to hear, and to not distort.
Thank you, Ginna. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Dvir, and everyone. And I appreciate speaking with you and look forward to listening to you for years to come.
We'll be right back after the break.
Hey, we want to tell you about another weekly Jewish podcast that we think you'll enjoy. It's called Chutzpah, Ancient Texts for Modern Times. Chutzpah is hosted by Scandal and West Wing actor Joshua Malina. I love Josh Malina. And renowned Rabbi Shira Stutman. They use the weekly Torah portion as a prompt to ponder spiritual matters, current events, and life's big questions. Episodes drop every Friday morning ahead of Shabbat. Chutzpah has welcomed exalted guests like Congressman Jamie Raskin, writer and thinker Wajat Ali, and celebrities including David Wayne, Dule Hill, Mary McCormick, and Scott Foley. Recent special episodes have focused on Passover, the war in Ukraine, and the 100th anniversary of the Bat Mitzvah. You can find all episodes of the podcast at chutzpah.com. That's CHUTZPOD.com. Or wherever fine podcasts are handed out for free. Chutzpah is proudly distributed by PRX.
There's really no way to follow a discussion of Holocaust denial. So we're going to close out with something entirely different. A new segment of the show.
Starting now, we're going to end each episode with a little something called
A Bintel Blitz!
Pew, 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 pew.
You've got a quick question, and we'll give you a quick hit on what we think you should do about it. Ready? Here we go.
Dear Bintel, I am zaftig, but in good health. My husband is on a fitness and keto kick and has lost 40 pounds. I feel he is judging me, and I worry he's not attracted to me. What do I do?
Okay, Zoftig. Yay, you're in good health, but you ask a question. You feel he's judging you. You feel he's not attracted to you. The only way to know is to ask.
I mean, Ginna, if he's doing keto, he might just be grumpy from all the no carbs. We don't know, but the point is we don't know. She doesn't know. She needs to ask, what's up? How you doing? What's going on? Let's refresh. What are you into these days? What are you into these days? Whatever you discover, it will get you to a place that's better than in your head. Do it over brisket. Not a sandwich, just the brisket.
This podcast is a product of The Forward. Our editor-in-chief is Jody Rudorin, and our CEO and publisher is Rachel Fishman-Feddersen. We're produced by Wonder Media Network, and our producer is Alessandra Wollner. Our production assistant is Carmen Borca Carrillo. Our executive producer is Ginny Kaplan. Special thanks again to Edward Blank, whose generosity makes this show possible.
We answer your questions and requests for advice here, so please send them to us. We want to hear from you. No questions too small, no questions too big. Give us the tea if you can. Can't wait to hear it. So please send your questions to bintel@forward.com or give us a call. You can leave a message at 201-540-9728.